What's up, scholars? Today we're going to take a look at a very dirty word, systemic racism. But before we do that, go ahead and smash the like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright, let's jump in. Systemic racism is a term that refers to a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or an organization. It manifests as discrimination in areas such as criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, education, and political representation. The term institutional racism, which is synonymous with systemic racism, was first coined in 1967 by Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton in Black Power: The Politics of Liberation. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote in 1967 that while individual racism is often identifiable because of its overt nature, institutional racism is less perceptible because of its less overt, far more subtle nature. Institutional racism originates in the operations of established and respected forces in the society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than individual racism. Systemic racism in the housing sector could be seen as early as the 1930s with the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Banks would determine a neighborhood's risk for loan defaults based on race and redline neighborhoods that were primarily black as unsuitable for a loan. In layman's terms, since most individuals, both black and white, could not buy a home in cash, banks made it almost impossible for African Americans to be homeowners. The racial segregation and disparity in wealth between European Americans and African American people included legacies of historical policies. In the Social Security Act of 1935, agriculture's workers and servants who disproportionately were black were excluded because key whites did not want government assistance to go to black people. It was only for whites. Yes, the Social Security Act was written in a way to exclude most black people. In the National Housing Act of 1935, the property appraisal system tied property value and eligibility for government loans to race. Between 1934 and 1962, less than 2% of government subsidies housing went to non-white people. Yes, the government primarily subsidized white homes and used race as the primary appraisal factor for home value. Lenders targeted high-interest subprime loans to low-income minority neighborhoods that might be eligible for fair-interest prime loan. Yes, regardless of eligibility, black people would get the worst loan deals possible, almost ensuring that the banks would be able to foreclose and take the home back. Systemic racism in our prison system. Studies also found that the high rates of incarceration reduced the number of available men in black communities and ruptured social relationships. But before you say that black people brought it on themselves, although approximately 2/3 of crack cocaine users are white or Hispanic people, a large percent of people actually convicted of possession of crack cocaine in federal courts in 1994 were black people. In 1994, 86.3% of the defendants convicted of crack cocaine possession were black people, while 10% were whites and 5.2% were Hispanics. Mandatory sentencing laws disproportionately affected African American people because of its severity, and mandatory sentencing laws was only mandatory for African Americans. Race and class is a reliable indicator of how and where industrial plants and waste facilities are located. Institutional environmental racism encompasses these land use decisions that contribute to health issues such as asthma, obesity, and diabetes. Yes, the government decided on where they would allow companies to pollute the environment and destroy people's childhood based on the color of their skin. Flint water crisis was no accident. A Stanford University study that analyzed 93 million traffic stops in the United States revealed that African Americans are 20% more likely to be stopped, despite being less likely to be in possession of contraband compared to white people. Do I need to explain that one to you as well? Black people were found to receive average sentences that were 238 days longer, Latino people 178 days longer for the same offenses as white people. The study concluded that regarding stop and frisks, the disparity in searches was more consistent with racial bias than with differences in criminal conduct. Alright family, we just looked at systemic racism in the housing system, how the government conspired against black people, and how banks conspired against black people to keep them in poverty and to stop them from literally building generational wealth, since home ownership has been the catalyst of wealth building in the United States historically. We see in the legal system how systemic racism plays into the sentencing of black people, and we see that in the policing of American citizens, black people are disproportionately affected by any laws that is created, not because of any extreme criminality, but because of systemic biases in the systems. So if you haven't already, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and like I always say, knowledge is power, but knowledge shared is power multiplied.